Piano Man fans were stunned when Long Island music treasure Billy Joel was forced to cancel his upcoming tour dates because of a shocking new medical diagnosis. The 76-year-old Uptown Girl singer was diagnosed with a rare brain disorder known as normal pressure hydrocephalus, or NPH. The Post spoke with Dr. Charles Matouk, the director of the Normal Pressure Hydrocephalus program at the Yale School of Medicine, to help understand what NPH is, how it's treated, and what the outlook might be for the legendary performer.
My name is Charles Matouk. I am the Vice Chair of Clinical Affairs for the Department of Neurosurgery at Yale School of Medicine, and I serve as the Section Chief of Neurovascular Surgery and the Director of the Normal Pressure Hydrocephalus program. NPH is commonly referred to as having water on the brain. So it's essentially a problem with water circulation in your head. And we experience it as difficulty walking or with your gait stability, difficulty thinking. So many people describe it as, their head is in a fog, or they can't think clearly, and difficulty controlling your bladder, which often starts at night, where you have to get up multiple times a night to go to the bathroom, and that can progress to having trouble during the day. Going to the bladder. When you have to go immediately. So that constellation of three symptoms often will alert, physicians and patients to the diagnosis or the possibility of the diagnosis. We don't know exactly the cause. We do know that it is an adult form of hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is a condition where water doesn't circulate or accumulates in the brain abnormally. It's often thought of as a disease in children. But normal pressure hydrocephalus is the most common form of adult onset hydrocephalus. It tends to affect older patients, so over the age of 65, and becomes more common as we get older, right? So if you're in the 65-year-old to 80-year-old sort of cohort, it maybe happens less than, its prevalence is maybe like 0.5% of the population. But as you get over the age of 80 or 90 even, that the prevalence of the disease increases dramatically, and as much as 5% of the population might be affected by it. Is NPH rare? And it is thought of as a rare disease, but I think of it actually as a disease that's woefully underdiagnosed. And so I think its true incidence and prevalence is much higher than we quote in our textbooks and in articles. And one of the reasons is that I don't think that there's anything normal about normal pressure hydrocephalus. And I think often symptoms will be dismissed as part of the normal aging process, right? We all have grandmas and grandpas that have bad hips and knees and have trouble walking, and that doesn't mean you have NPH. And as you get older, it's quite common to not be able to have as good control of your bladder function in both men and women. And it's many people have trouble with their memory as they get older, being engaged in life, or sort of like being as fulfilled in life as they once were when they were younger. So it's often dismissed by patients and even providers, medical providers, as part of the normal aging process. I think as a result, not as many people get the help they need as would otherwise be. How do you distinguish between normal aging and having problems that might actually have nothing to do with NPH, and then being worried about the condition and, maybe this is something that needs to be worked up further? And I think progression over time is really the red flag symptom. And so if things are progressive, especially in all three spheres of dysfunction, so the walking trouble, the urine problem, the cognition problem, if they're getting worse over time, and there doesn't seem to be a good explanation for why things are getting worse over time, that should really be the trigger to get help. And especially if the symptoms have progressed to the point where they now impact your quality of life. So you're not able to do the things that you want to do to enjoy the rest of your life. The workup then involves, if you have this suspected condition, is to get a brain imaging study. So if you have this clinical constellation, they call it the clinical triad, those three things that we talked about that are characteristic clinically of NPH, if on an imaging study, either a CAT scan or an MRI, you then have what looks like disproportionately enlarged fluid-filled spaces in the brain. So we all make fluid in the brain, and the chamber in which the fluid is housed is called the ventricles. And if those ventricular spaces are larger appearing than they should be, right, than the general population, coupled with that clinical triad at presentation, you get the diagnosis of suspected NPH. And to establish the diagnosis, you have to have improvement, which is transient, but you have to have improvement after a spinal tap. So the spinal tap basically is a lumbar puncture where we put a needle in your back and we can access the fluid in your back, which is connected to the fluid in your brain. And if we take some of it off and you feel better, that then establishes the diagnosis of NPH, and then you're eligible for a treatment called a ventricular shunt, which is a surgical procedure. Treatments for NPH currently are limited. Physical therapy, I think, is always a good first place to start. But what patients with NPH often experience is that the work that they put into physical therapy isn't translated to clinical benefit. And so surgery really remains the only sort of like viable treatment option for patients with progressive NPH that's disabling and affecting their quality of life or their ability to do the things that they want to do. Physical therapy can focus on different sort of like issues, right? So sometimes it has to do with strength in a limb. Sometimes it has to do with coordination. Sometimes it has to do with like upper mobility strength after stroke. So physical therapy can mean different things depending on the condition and the neurological issue. In NPH in particular, the physical therapy is really targeted at improving gait stability. So your stability on your feet, the quality of your gait. So there's, we don't think about these things a lot, but if you think about like in the movies, if people are walking funny, you immediately can tell, right, that it's not a normal gait. And so people with NPH have a particular abnormality in their gait that physical therapy can help rehab on its own. You just have to remind the body, consciously to do the right movements as opposed to these sort of more abnormal movements. The surgical procedure itself is relatively straightforward, but it is invasive and involves making an incision in your scalp, drilling a hole in your head with a drill, and then we have to access the fluid-filled center of your brain using a long plastic tube called a catheter. That plastic tube then gets tunneled under your skin and behind your ear, and the end of that tube basically goes into some space in your body that naturally absorbs fluid. So that could be the lining of your belly, that could be the lining of your lung, or it could be directly into your heart, for example, through the internal jugular vein in your neck. But basically some bypass, because the fundamental problem with normal pressure hydrocephalus is that fluid is basically building up in your head and not able to get out. And so this creates a bypass pathway by which fluid can get out of your head, so it doesn't compress your brain as much and you can feel better. The great thing about NPH compared to many of the other conditions that it's sometimes confused with, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, is that many of the symptoms are reversible and can be definitely improved after surgery, especially the gait problems and the bladder control issues. And so that's a key thing to keep in mind, because there's not a lot of things in this, this category of diseases of cognitive problems and movement disorders that have a relatively straightforward surgical solution that can actually reverse symptoms that you're having. So it's something that you don't want to miss. While shunt surgery can have complications, it's still brain surgery like any operation. It is generally well tolerated. It usually only involves a day or two in the hospital and maybe 2 weeks of recovery. And what we'll often tell patients is that the shunt doesn't magically work on its own, but what it does do is that it allows the work that you put into physical therapy to be translated to clinical benefit. And that's really the magic of the shunt. The biggest, I think, take-home message for me is that if I want people to know something, it would be that, again, this idea that normal pressure hydrocephalus is not normal. And even though it is common as we age to have issues with your gait, cognition, and bladder control, that especially if they're all happening together and they're progressive over time, to really think about this diagnosis and if, you know, Billy Joel's bravery for coming forward with a diagnosis and his star power can shed a brighter light on this condition, I think that would be great, because then more people will get the help they need more quickly.